Hi, this is a talk I gave at the Guild of OneName study meeting on the 15th of March of 2013, and the title is How DNA Testing Can Help Your OneName Study. So it is very much focused on how DNA testing can assist members of the Guild in conducting their own OneName study. This presentation will be available on the website, the Spear and Surname Project, which you can search for just by Googling. Now, the main reason why we actually use genetic genealogy is because we hit so many brick walls when we do traditional genealogical research. This is an example from my own family tree. Here we have the dates on the left-hand side, going back all the way to 1660, but I have hit my brick walls around about 1800. And at the level of my 3 times great-grandparents, I've identified 12 of them. I have 6 candidates for the remainder, and those are indicated by the question marks. And I do not know 14 of my great-great-great-grandparents. So this is where my brick walls exist, and this is having exhausted the available references that are available to us, the common documentary resources. So this is where we turn to DNA testing, and a DNA test involves scraping your cheek or spitting into a vial. That is then put into a test tube, which you then post off to the lab. So it's really quite a very simple procedure. Once your DNA sample gets to the lab, they extract the DNA, run it through their machine, and then they come out with your results, your unique genetic signature, which is posted on your web page. Now, that tells you a lot of information in and of itself, but more importantly, what they do is they compare your results with everybody else in their database, and they find those people who match your unique genetic signature. And these matches are probably related to you within a genealogical time frame, that is, the last 1,000 years or so. And these matches are also made available to you on your unique web page with your username and password, and you can contact these matches and collaborate with them. I see that we have similar genetic signatures, you might say. That means we're probably genetically related. Shall we compare our family trees and figure out where that connection might actually be? Now, the third important aspect of genetic testing is that you can get involved with a variety of different projects, and the particular web page or website that deals with these projects is Family Tree DNA. They have the best setup. So that's 3 important things you get from DNA testing. You get your own unique results, you get matches with other people, and you get the opportunity to collaborate on specific projects. There are 3 types of DNA test. The first type is the YDNA test. The Y chromosome is passed from father to son along a direct male line. So, for example, I will have received my Y chromosome from my father. He will have received it from his father, his father's father, his father's father, etc., all the way back to approximately 338,000 years is the current estimate. On the female side, the direct female line, we have the mitochondrial DNA, and this is passed from a mother to her offspring, both sons and daughters, but only the daughters will pass it on to their offspring. So I will have received my mitochondrial DNA from my mother, she from her mother, she from her mother, mother, all the way back on the direct female line. So whereas the Y-DNA test goes back on the direct male line on one side of your family tree, the mitochondrial DNA goes back on the direct female line on the other side of your family tree. But of course, these 2 tests ignore everybody in the middle. So at the level of your 3 times great-grandparent, the Y will give you information about your great-great-great-grandfather on the direct male line. The mitochondrial DNA test will give you information about your great-great-great-grandmother on the direct female line, but all of your other 30 great-great-great-grandparents in between will have been ignored completely by this test, or by these tests, I should say. And to address that particular issue, there's a 3rd type of test called the autosomal DNA test, and this looks at all of the other chromosomes, including the Y chromosome, and it gives you information about everybody in between the two extremities. The trouble is that this particular test has only got a reach of about 7 generations. So if you allow maybe 30 years per generation, it will only take you back to a common ancestor who was born about 200, 210 years before your date of birth. So if you were born in 1930, this will take you back to a common ancestor born about 1720, but highly unlikely to take you back further than that. And that's because the further back you go, the amount of DNA that you will have received from any individual great-great-great-grandparent, for example, will be smaller and smaller and smaller with each subsequent generation, and it becomes very, very dilute indeed. So that's why the reach of this test only goes back to about 7 generations. However, all of these tests have their pros and their cons, and they are very useful, or can be very useful, genetic genealogy tools in helping you to break down the brick walls in your own family tree. Now, there are 3 companies that supply these types of tests: Family Tree DNA, 23andMe, and Ancestry DNA. Family Tree DNA only it's the only company that actually does STR testing. Now, I'm going to mention briefly that there are 2 types of marker, the STR marker and the SNP marker, also known as SNPs. You don't need to know very much more about the technicalities than that. The fact that there are 2 different types of marker mean that you cannot compare a YDNA STR marker with a YDNA SNP marker, for example. So, and Family Tree DNA are the only company that do STR testing currently on the YDNA, and STR testing is what is currently the industry standard for doing research with OneName studies and surname projects. And Family Tree DNA has the best setup for these types of surname projects, and it has the largest genealogical database. 23andMe, on the other hand, focuses to a large extent on medical risk testing, but they also do genealogy as well. And they have a very good offer for a package of both autosomal Y and mitochondrial DNA using SNP testing for $99. But for us in the UK, we'll have to add an extra $89 for postage via DHL and an extra $79 if we want to have our data uploaded to Family Tree DNA, which actually is quite a good idea. So there are certain drawbacks with 23andMe, but for those of you interested in looking at medical risk testing, then this would be the company to go for. It also possibly is the best for ethnic admixture testing. More of a consideration for our American cousins than it would be for us in the UK, but that can also give you some very useful information about the possible origins, possible different ethnic origins of the ancestors within your family tree. The third company, Ancestry DNA, only does autosomal DNA now. It used to do YDNA, but it only does autosomal currently. The good thing about this is that it links to trees on Ancestry. And of course, Ancestry is a very popular place for putting your family tree, although a lot of them tend to be inaccurate. So the fact that it does link to these family trees can be a very great advantage. The problem is that this test is only currently available in the US, and there don't appear to be any plans to roll it out to Europe at this point in time. There's a very useful series of comparison charts looking at YDNA testing, mitochondrial DNA testing, and autosomal DNA testing, comparing the different companies, and these comparison charts are on the ISOG website. Now, ISOG is the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, and if you do decide to go down the route of genetic testing, you should definitely join this society because it gives you a lot of support. It basically is a group of individuals who have all been tested or who have all undertaken DNA testing. There's about 8,000 people who are members of the society, and it really is a group that helps support people who are interested in genetic genealogy. It advocates the use of genetic genealogy and tries to educate people about the use of genetics as a tool for genealogical research. And they've got 2 very important groups. One is the DNA newbie group, so if you're completely new to DNA, then definitely do sign up to join this group because it will help you in the early stages of setting up your DNA project. The other very important website or group is the project administrators group, and that's the last link you see here on this slide. And this particular group is specifically for project administrators, and it gives a lot of very, very useful information and support. So do join ISOG if you do decide to go down the route of DNA testing. Let's look at the website of Family Tree DNA. Now, this is the home page, and the important thing here is the search facility over on the right-hand side. And here you can search for your name from the actual home page itself. And I searched for the name Pomeroy, and here we see it here, and there are 10 counts of the name Pomeroy in the DNA database, and this tells me that there are 10 people with the name Pomeroy who've already been tested. So if my name was Pomeroy, I would not be the only person in the FTDNA database were I to do the test. There are 10 people already sitting there waiting to be discovered, and I may even match some of them. They may be my genetic cousins. The other important result from this search is that there is a match with surname projects. So there is a surname project where these Pomeroys exist. The 10 of these, or some of these Pomeroys at least, have joined this Pomeroy surname project. You'll see it has the guild logo there beside it, and there are 107 members in this particular Pomeroy project. However, there are 10 Pomeroys and 107 members. Why the disparity? Because of the surname variants. And there are many surname variants of Pomeroy, including Pomeroy, Pomeroy, etc., etc., etc. And if I did a search for Pomeroy, what we would see is that there are 83 people with the surname Pomeroy in the database. And here we have also the same Pomeroy project, and 107 members. And some of these are members of the Devon project as well. So this is a geographical project rather than a surname project, and this geographical project just looks at the genetic signature of people from a particular place. So that tells me a lot about the surname Pomeroy and Pomeroy already, and that's without even taking a DNA test. And I can click on this link here to the surname project and see what that's all about. I can see the results so far, and that can give me some useful information about my family. And that's all without even taking a DNA test. The Family Tree DNA database is approximately 70% US and 30% non-US. This particular table just compares the data from 2011 with the data from 2013, and you'll see that there's a 23% increase in the number of records that they currently have, and that's a 23% increase over the space of 2 years, so that's about 12%, 11% per year, and it's just really to emphasize that the database is constantly growing. And from the point of view of OneName studies and surname projects, which would be associated with the YDNA test, there are 250,000 records for YDNA. So it has a very large database. The other thing to note is that there are approximately 6,000 surname projects, and this is from the home page of Family Tree DNA, and you can see the various projects beginning with each of the letters of the alphabet. I went through these to see how many of them were identified by the guild logo, and here is the results in this table at the bottom right hand side of the graph of the slide, and there are 259 Goons projects on Family Tree DNA, which represents about 4.3% of the total number of projects. But there probably are a lot of projects that are OneName studies, guild OneName studies, that are not identified by the guild logo, and so it probably is higher than 4%, maybe closer to 6 or 7%. Here's an example of some of the Goons projects on Family Tree DNA, and these are the projects that begin with A. And the point to make here is that they vary in size, and this may either be because they are an ongoing project, they're not a mature YDNA project, and they are collecting, there's an ongoing collection of data and participants. Or it could be that it takes only 2 or 3 people to answer the specific question that you want DNA to assist you with. You don't need to have a big project to get a lot of information about your particular surname project. Several fairly mature OneName studies that many of you will be familiar with are listed here on the right hand side, and you'll see the number of participants in each of those projects. Some of them are fairly small, some of them are fairly big. So for example, the Irwin Clan project is quite a large study, whereas the Career project is a very mature OneName study and a very mature YDNA study, and that only has 28 participants, but those 28 participants were sufficient to answer the questions posed at the start of the study. So there are 2 approaches to DNA testing. You can either go on a fishing trip or you can ask a specific question. Now, if you go on a fishing trip, you just basically take the test and see what you catch. If you're asking a specific question, and this is of particular relevance to OneName studies, the question usually is, I'm sure we're related to that crowd, what is the connection? If you're just going on a fishing trip, only you need to take the test, but if you're asking a specific question, as many people doing OneName studies will be, then you and other people need to take the test, so you will need to recruit people for this particular project. Let's look at the YDNA test, which is the most relevant for OneName studies, and let's give an example of DNA testing from my particular project, the Spear and Surname project. Now, my name is Gleason, so my direct male line, which contains the YDNA, goes back via my Gleason line. So how am I going to get a Spearin? But first of all, let's look at the direct male line. Now, here's the direct male line here. If we move that out to the side and then get rid of everything else in the middle, the YDNA test will allow us to connect via a direct male line to anybody else who connects to one of our ancestors via a direct male line. So, for example, my brothers would connect via a direct male line to my father. My first cousins would connect via a direct male line to my father's father. My second cousins via a direct male line to my father's father's father, and so on. Third cousins, fourth cousins, fifth cousins, all the way out to the time before surnames began, and ultimately going back to our current estimate of 338,000 years. So that is the direct male line. Let's look specifically at the Spear and Surname project and how YDNA testing has helped my particular OneName study. And we have a dedicated website, and we also have our results on the Family Tree DNA website, and I'll show you some of those. Just to talk briefly about the structure of my specific Spear and OneName study, we have 3 administrators, Bob in myself in the UK, Bob in the US, and Margaret in Ireland. And we have a dedicated website which allows for ongoing publication of the evidence as we accumulate it. And we have standard sections on the surname meaning, its variance, its distribution, all the usual categories suggested by the Goons guidelines. And we have the YDNA project on Family Tree DNA, which effectively has bonded several surname variants together genetically and has confirmed that a certain number of people within our surname study are genetically related. We have a Facebook page to generate interest, discussion, create some momentum, and this is where we get a lot of our recruits for DNA testing. And we have a quarterly newsletter with updates both on the traditional genealogical activities and also the genetic genealogical activities. So here's the home page of the Spear and Surname project. You'll see in the menu on the left-hand side that we have a variety of different categories. The most important are the traditional genealogy and the genetic genealogy. The traditional genealogy is further broken down into a variety of important subgroups, looking at the European evidence, the evidence from Spearans in Cambridge, London, Limerick, and so on. And the genetic genealogy section is broken down into some general information about genetics, but most importantly, the actual results, and the last section on how to interpret the results. So this is an ongoing project, and the fact that we do it on an ongoing basis means that we're able to keep up to date with new developments as they occur. Now, the most important part of the website is probably what we call the traditional families table, and this is a table of families that we have identified via traditional documentary research, and this table includes the identification of the family, the most distant known ancestor, the place of birth, year of death, the place of death, and the spouse. And we try to write mini family biographies just to help orientate ourselves. Now, to date, we have identified 45 families in the UK, 18 Spearman families in Ireland, 25 in Australia, 11 in Canada, and 132 in the United States. So this gives us an idea of the scope of the project, and we are constantly going through a process of refinement, updating, creating a skeleton, and then hanging meat on that skeleton as we go along. So that's the structure of the OneName study. But how did I get Spearman YDNA in my own particular family? Because my name is Gleason, so my direct male line goes back on a long line of Gleasons. My Spearman ancestor is right in the middle of my ancestors. And in order to get that YDNA, I had to go back to my great-great-great-grandfather, and I had to trace his descendants down and find a direct male line. I eventually found a third cousin of my father's who agreed to take the test, and that's how I got my YDNA. Now, the story of the Spearmans is quite interesting. When I first met Bob, it was 4 or 5 years ago at this stage, he told me a very interesting story about how himself and some of his collaborators had found the extracts of 2 wills of a Luke and Matthew Spearman from Limerick in the early 1700s, and on the basis of these wills, he was able to put together a crude family tree of these early Limerick Spearmans. And they married into a family called Hartwell. And the Hartwells were mayors of Limerick in the late 1600s, and they had been granted land in Limerick because they had fought in the armies of Charles I. So after Cromwell's conquest of Ireland, they were granted land in Limerick. And the Hartwells married into the Spearmans and named their children Hartwell Spearman, George Hartwell Spearman, Charles Hartwell Spearman, which is an unusual surname combination. In fact, the name Hartwell Spearman occurs in 24 of the 236 branches of Spearmans that we have identified so far. There's also a scrap of evidence from the chief herald, Sir William Beetham, who spent years and decades poring over a lot of these wills and putting together draft family pedigrees. And he linked the Spearmans in Limerick to a family of Sperrings, or Spearings, in London. And these Spearings were goldsmiths, and they lived in Leadenhall Street, and we have lots of information about them. I even have the floor plans of the places where they lived. And they lived near St. Andrew's Undershaft, which is right beside the Gherkin. Now, there is some evidence of a connection then with Cambridge, where in 1534, Henry VIII gave a decree that allowed Nicholas Spearing to become one of the first printers of the Cambridge University Press. And this Nicholas Spearing came from Flanders, the Low Country, where there were a lot of Spearings involved in the book business. And this particular Nicholas Spearing was best friends with Erasmus, arguably Europe's greatest intellectual at the time. So it was quite a fantastical story. I mean, could I possibly be related to Nicholas Spearing, who was best friends with Erasmus? That was the challenge that we were set. Could we actually confirm this connection. So in 2010, 4 of the Spearman collaborators decided to take a DNA test, and it showed that they were almost identical in terms of their genetic signature. And just to orientate you to this particular slide, if you imagine up here at the top, we have the Y chromosome lying on its side, and all along the Y chromosome are a variety of different markers. And here you see the markers with their various names and labels up here at the top. Now, each marker has a specific value, and the values are written underneath of the markers for each of the participants in this particular study. And there's 4 participants here, and here you can see the values going across from left to right, and all of them are identical apart from this one here, indicated by the purple square on the right hand side. And this indicates that there's a slight difference, a mutation of 1 point between this particular individual and the other individuals in this group. So this was very encouraging, because what it suggested was the people with different surname variants, Spearing, Spearin, with 2 E's, and Spearin with an E and an A, were all genetic cousins. It indicated that there was a common ancestor to all of them within a genealogical time frame, that is, within the last 1,000 years or so. So I decided to take the test, and I managed to find, like I say, this 3rd cousin of my father's. He took the test, and his results were also identical with the other people in the group. So my particular spelling variant of Spearin was part of this larger Spearin family, and I too shared a common ancestor with these people within a genealogical time frame. Other people were tested, and we've put together quite a large group of people now, about 10 or 12, who are all genetically related. They share either an exact match or a close match on their YDNA test. But there were other Spearins who tested who did not match this initial group. And this could either indicate a non-paternity event, in other words, the YDNA that has been passed down from father to son, there's been an interruption somewhere along the line, and it could have been 100 years ago, it could have been 200, 300, 400 years ago, and that might be due to an illegitimacy, which is the most, it's the conclusion we all jump to, but there may have been an adoption, there might have been a legal name change, there's a lot of reasons for why there might be what's termed a non-paternity event. The other possibility is, of course, that some of these Spearins might not be related at all within a genealogical time frame, and that might indicate a multiple origin for the surname Spearin rather than a single origin. So some of these people, like the Spearing down here, that might be a surname that comes from a completely different origin to the Spearins up here in genetic family 1. So the other important thing is the haplogroup. Now, the haplogroup refers to, or can be summarized as, a group of individuals with a similar genetic signature. And it's just a very crude way of grouping people together. And there are various haplogroups ranging from haplogroup A down to about haplogroup T or so. And they're just very crude ways of lumping people together. But they do give you a certain amount of information. Everybody in genetic family 1, for example, belongs to haplogroup I2b1, but people in genetic family 2, 3, 4, and 5 all belong to haplogroup OR1b1a2. Not only that, they belong to OR1b1a2, but they are not closely related to each other. The genetic signature belongs to that haplogroup, but it actually is quite far apart for each of the individuals. So that's why they're put into separate genetic families. But let's look at the haplogroup of genetic family 1, and that is I2b1. And here's a map of that particular haplogroup and the frequency of its occurrence across Europe. And you'll see that there is a particularly high occurrence of this haplogroup in northern Germany, perhaps going across into Belgium and maybe the Netherlands. And this certainly would be consistent with the story that the Spearans originally came from the lowlands of Europe. It's not confirmatory, but it certainly is another piece of circumstantial evidence that supports the story. So, what have we learnt? Well, here is a summary of the Spearan family tree as it currently is, and here you see members of genetic family 1 all the way across the page, the slide. One member of genetic family 2. The red boxes indicate the most distant known ancestor in each of these families, and we have an Ontario family here, we have a Dublin family here. This is my own particular family. We have a New Jersey family, a Limerick family, a New South Wales family, and a Georgia family. And here on the left-hand side you can see a crude timeline going back to about 1410. Each of these families has been able to trace their most distant known ancestor through documentary evidence to about 1800, maybe just into the 1700s. But then there's a large gap before we see the early Limerick Spearans, Matthew and Luke and their brother Nicholas, and they married into the Hartwells, of course. There's a Hartwell there. But there's about 3 or 4 generations possibly between these early Limerick Spearans and the most distant known ancestors of each of the families in our project so far. Then we have the London Spearings up here, and there is a disconnect between the London Spearings and the early Limerick Spearans that still needs to be addressed. And here we have the Cambridge Spearans up here, and there's a break between the Cambridge Spearans and the London Spearans. So the people who tested are indicated by these blue squares down here, and we have 1 representative from most families. This particular family here in Ontario, we have 2 representatives from that particular family. And what DNA testing has helped us achieve is it has helped us confirm the theory. We are all definitely related. Everybody in genetic family 1 is definitely related to each other within a genealogical time frame. And that genealogical time frame is probably within the last 300 to 400 years, which fits, of course, with the idea that we're related to these early Limerick Spearans. Now, as I said previously, some of the families contain this unusual surname combination, Hartwell-Spearan, and here's an example of that family from Ontario. There's a Hartwell-Spearan here, and there's 2 Hartwell-Spearans in this line. So the likelihood is that because this family has Hartwell-Spearans, they are related to the Hartwell-Spearans of early Limerick, but because we're all genetically related to each other, it means that we can piggyback onto this Ontario family and jump across the divide of the 1700s back to the early Limerick Spearans. Now, we still have to find documentary evidence that this link suggested by genetic testing actually does exist, and that's a large part of our current activity. But we also need to try and establish a better link to the London Spearings. At the moment we just have that scrap of information from Sir William Beetham, but it would be great if we could find a direct male line descendant of the London Spearings that we could do genetic testing on, and if he matched the genetic signature of those in genetic family 1, this would be further circumstantial evidence to suggest that there is a direct link between the early Limerick Spearans and the London Spearings. The other thing we have to do is we have to further explore the possibility of a relationship with the Cambridge Spearings, and this will require further documentary research, but also if we can find a descendant, a direct male line descendant of the Cambridge Spearings, and then get them to do the test. If they match the genetic signature of those in genetic family 1, then we have established that there is a direct connection with the Cambridge Spearings as well. And we might be related to other English and European Spearings, so testing other Spearings within England and within Europe will help decide if our particular branch of the family, the Limerick Spearans, are related to English Spearings and European Spearings, and it will also give us information about whether or not the origin of the surname Spearing is a single origin or a multiple origin. So, for the future, we will need to test all 236 branches that we have identified so far that exist all across the world with the name Spearing, or its many variants. That will be a big task. The other thing that we could do with DNA is build a mutation history tree. Now, this is like a family history tree, except it's looking at the mutations that occur. And it may be possible in the future that we will be able to identify branches of the family that are more closely related to each other because they share the same mutation, and distinguish them from families that are more distantly related because they don't share that same mutation, or they are what's called a further genetic distance away from that particular family. And that could be very useful in helping to direct further research. It could tell you which families are closer to each other and therefore should be collaborating more closely to find a common ancestor. The other thing, of course, we have to do is we then have to document each tree. So genetic testing is not the end of the story, it just is another step along the way. And it leads to as many questions as it does answer them. So we will have that ongoing need to document each tree within the project. And of course we have to test further English and European Spearings to see whether there is a relation to the Irish Spearings, and to establish whether the origin of the surname is a single origin or a multi-origin. So that is where we currently are. A quick word about autosomal DNA, and like I said previously, this has a reach of about 7 generations, or about 210 years, and this can be useful as well in OneName studies. So with DNA testing in my family tree, I've taken the test, and that allows me to go back to about 1765 or so, which has a reach to my 4 times great grandparents, and there are 64 of those. But I've also got my dad to do the test, and he is able to therefore extend us back an extra generation to about a common ancestor born in 1730 or so. And I got my aunt to do the test on my maternal side, so that again extends the reach of our autosomal test to about 1730 or so. Now, it has been used successfully by John Creer in his OneName study to break through a brick wall, and this is described in the most recent edition of the Journal of OneName Studies, the Q1 2013 edition of the journal. And John started his study, started his genealogical research back in 2000, but very quickly hit a brick wall. He wasn't able to find his 3 times great grandfather. There was no date of birth for him, and he could not identify his parents. His grandfather's, or 3 times great grandfather's name was also John Creer, and there were a lot of John Creers around, and so he started the OneName study, thinking that by a simple process of elimination I'll be able to find my 3 times great grandfather. Well, 5 years later he had a very mature OneName study on his hand with 23,000 records, 70 families, but still no definite answer. He had a short list, but it just wasn't short enough. So that's when he started the Creer YDNA study. And that ran for 2 years, and he collected YDNA on 28 participants, and it gave him a lot of information. He was able to link a lot of the families in his tree genetically, and it made the shortlist shorter, but it still did not provide him with a definite answer. So in 2010, he took the autosomal DNA test, and he waited, and then in late 2011, 2 matches appeared within a month of each other, with possible Creer ancestors. And by collaborating with these individuals, he was able to determine that the first match appeared closer to him genetically than it actually was, because of 2 sets of first cousins marrying each other. And in the Isle of Man, a small island community, this sort of thing is not unexpected at all. But the fact that you have 2 cousins marrying each other means that there's a higher proportion of DNA passed down than would normally be the case. And so a match appears closer genetically than it actually is genealogically. But John was able to establish that the 4 times great grandmother of this particular match was the sister of his John Grier 3 times great-grandfather. And the second match provided further corroborative evidence. So this was a very good example of how autosomal DNA can help break through the brick walls that still exist after the YDNA testing has been completed. It's a bit hit and miss because the reach of this test, just being 200 years, means that it has quite significant limitations. But, to quote John, "The brick wall in my paternal line around 1800 has now, after 12 years of toil, been broken through in a most satisfying way." And that's a wonderful, happy ending to John's particular story. And there we have it, really. There are all 3 tests that we mentioned, the YDNA, the mitochondrial DNA, and the autosomal DNA test, can answer specific questions. And it's very important to be specific about the questions that you have and that you want to have answered by these tests. The YDNA testing detects relatives on the direct male line. Because both YDNA and surnames pass down from fathers to son, it is of particular use in OneName studies and is the test of choice. Family tree DNA would probably at this point in time be the company of choice to test with, because it has 250,000 YDNA tests already. The database is increasing by about 10% each year, and there are at least 259 guild projects currently running there. And the test of choice is still currently the YDNA 37 marker test. And this looks at STR markers rather than SNPs, but this may change in the future. Now, we haven't talked about mitochondrial DNA testing to any great extent, but this detects relatives on the maternal line. It's very, very useful, especially when we're looking at ancient DNA, because the mitochondrial DNA is easier to process. And examples of the successful use of mitochondrial DNA testing would be in the case of Anastasia, the recent case of Richard III, and also in the case of Ned Kelly. And if you Google these, you'll find some information on how DNA testing has helped with each of these cases. Lastly, the autosomal testing detects relatives on all of your family lines, but it only has a reach of about 210 years. It does test up to third cousins reliably. Fourth cousins, not so much. Fifth cousins, it only detects about 10% of those. And when you're getting back that far, it does get difficult to find where the possible connection might be, especially when you're talking about Irish family history research. But a good example of how it can be used successfully is with the career OneName study. So there we go. That is the presentation. If you do need to get further information, then please do check out the Spear and Surname project. If you Google it, it's the first thing that comes up. And also I have a blog spot at DNA and Family Tree Research, which will be a repository for any pieces of information, hints and tips, and sharing good practice that I happen to pick up along the way. Thanks very much.